In this video, we're going to talk about more fundamental server control concepts. This is a PowerPoint only video. In the last two videos in this series, we've seen how a server control is created in Visual Studio.net. We showed how to create properties that show up in the properties window, and we did that by adorning our public properties within code with various attributes. We've seen also how to override the render method, which allows us to spit out HTML that gets sent to the output stream and then on to the client's web browser. But to go any farther, we're going to have to understand more about the inner workings of server controls so that we can discuss, first of all, how to retrieve and set state of our controls so that when they're placed on a web form, it appears as if they maintain state even though the web is a stateless environment. We're going to have to know more so we can discuss how to create events for our server controls and allow the web form that hosts the server control to handle that event. We're going to need to know more so we can find out how we can process the data in our server control when the form it resides on has been posted back to the server. How can we be notified that our server control's content has been changed? We need to have this information. We're going to need to know more so that we can learn how to create composite controls, which are made up of multiple ASP.NET server controls. We're going to need to know more so we can learn how to create templated controls like the repeater or the data grid. And not only that, but how to make our templated controls into data-bound controls. So to dig into more about server controls, we're going to need to look at what all server controls are based on. All server controls have either one of two things in common. They have to inherit from either the control or the web control base class. The main reason that you choose one over the other is that the web control base class provides additional members for displaying a user interface, while the control class doesn't have much in the way of user interface specific features. So if you're creating a control that doesn't have any UI or is a composite control that combines other controls that render their own UI, it's best to derive your new server control from the control base class. Don't worry, we're going to take a look at the members of each one of these base classes so that you get a better idea in general of what their task is. So first of all, we're going to take a look at the control base class. And what I did is I took the properties and methods and even the events and kind of lumped them together into major categories. And you're not going to find this in the help. This was just an exercise that I did to try to understand kind of the domain of the control base class, and then I do the same thing for the web control base class, just so I can understand what kinds of things is the control base class concerned with. So you're going to have the obvious things like creation, destruction, but then also it has different identifiers like the ID, the client ID, unique ID. These are different ways that a specific instance of your server control are represented either in ASP or to the web client. You have various properties and methods for managing child controls. You have, conversely, other properties and methods that manage server controls of the container that it resides in so that you can access it. You'll have a couple of methods and properties for data binding, and then also for controlling the execution lifestyle. The life cycle rather. And we're going to talk about the control execution life cycle in just a moment. But it's basically all the steps that a server control goes through whenever it's requested on a web page and then displayed to the user. And then finally, and probably most importantly, its ability, it has various properties and methods for managing the view state. And so this means that one of the first questions is answered, which is how can we retrieve and set the state of a server control using its view state? And the answer is that a lot of that functionality is built into the control base class. It has properties and methods that we can override to save information that's important to our server control into the view state and then retrieve it out whenever the form is posted back to the server. And we're going to talk more about this in the 6th video in this series called Understanding Postback Data. Let's continue on then to the web control base class's members. First of all, it inherits everything from control. So you don't lose any of the functionality we just talked about. In fact, you just gain about 4 more categories of properties and methods, and one of them is tag management. If you're familiar with tags, it allows you to put extra data into a server control. Managing the style, so you can set some DHTML attributes there. Then there's attribute management, and we've already seen it at work a little bit whenever we were developing some very fundamental server controls, and then finally the general UI properties like back color, border color, and so on. And so by creating controls that inherit from either the control or the web control base class, we have the opportunity to plug into and change the default behavior of a server control without having to implement each and every one of the properties and methods that are listed here, if we don't want to or we don't need to. Let's move on now to server control events. So now that we understand that our controls must derive from one of these base classes, let's talk about how the server controls are used within ASP.NET. You know, in a Windows Forms application, you can have many events, anything from the user moused over a particular control to the control changed in some way and an event is fired. You're obviously, whenever the user clicks on a button or on some control, there's going to be an event for that. Perhaps a keystroke was captured. There's many different events. But this is very different from how ASP.NET works. Probably the most important concept to understand is that in ASP.NET there's really only one event that ever occurs on the client, and that's the postback event. The postback event is the equivalent to submitting or posting a web page's form. When any control on the web form triggers a postback event, the entire page's form, including all the content and all the values that were either changed or left alone, all of that information is submitted to the ASP.NET handler, which in turn kicks off the control execution lifecycle for each control on the web form. And once the postback occurs, then the ASP.NET handler begins to process the form data that was sent by the web form in conjunction with the page and each of the server controls that it contains. The control execution lifecycle will help us understand what happens from the point when a page is posted back until the time when it's rendered back to the client's web browser. Before we get started, I wanted to bring up Visual Studio.NET and show you how to locate the control lifecycle, or I'm sorry, control execution lifecycle entry in the help. And what this has is a very nice explanation of each of the phases that your control and the page will go through, what the control needs to do at that particular phase, and then if you wanted to override it, how you would accomplish that. So I would highly recommend you take a look through this particular help entry. Let's go ahead and get started at a very high-level explanation of each of the phases in the control execution lifecycle. First of all, obviously, the client is going to request a new page in his web browser. And when this occurs, that request will be funneled to the ASP.NET runtime, which will then start the process of initializing the web form itself and all the controls on that web form. And it will set all the control values to their initial state. The next step is that the view state will be loaded in, so it'll take the hidden control variable view state and start to parse it and put any changes or any of the properties there into each of the respective controls. The next step is to process the postback data. When the user of the web form makes changes, these changes need to get registered somehow and saved into the properties, and we also need to know what the old value and the new value is. And so this is the place where that happens. The next step is the load, and at this point everything is created and initialized with all the values from the client, and it's loaded into the control tree. So we have a picture of everything that changed, all the current values, and now we're ready to process any changes that we want to make programmatically before we send the results back to the end user. The next phase is the sending of postback change notifications. Back in 2 steps previous, process postback data, we get to decide if we want to what's changed and whether it should trigger this phase or not. If we decide to trigger this phase, then we get an opportunity here to respond to the change in state. So we get to do validation, and most importantly, we may want to raise an event back to the web form so that whoever created the code in the web form would be able to handle like a text changed event, for example. Moving along, the next phase is to handle postback events. One control is going to be responsible for causing the postback event, and so at this point that control gets an opportunity to raise an event back up to the web form, and the programmer there can write code that allows him to process whatever he needs to do at that point. Then the next step is the pre-render phase. If the developer chose to change some of the values as a result of the business rules that he codes into the postback event, then the control and its new properties will be kind of compiled and all gathered together here before the next phase, which is the saving of the state. And so the view state property will be reconstructed and placed into a string, and then placed ultimately in the hidden form variable in the next step, which is render. And this is where you have to construct the output of the control by overriding the render method. We've already done this in the previous videos. And this is also where the view state will ultimately be rendered out to the client. And then finally there will be the dispose and the unload phases, which allows for final cleanup. So now that we've looked at the control execution lifecycle, we can begin to answer 2 of the questions that we posed initially. And the first question was how to create events for our server controls and allow the web form that hosts the server control to handle that event. And as we noted, there's really only one event on the client in ASP.NET. Since all the processing has to occur on the server, the web form must be posted back from the client to the server so that processing can begin and other events can be raised on the server. If we want our server control to trigger the postback event, we must implement an interface called the iPostback event handler within our server control. When we implement this interface, ASP.NET will check to see if our server control was indeed the one that was responsible for the postback. And if it was, then ASP.NET will allow us to handle the postback event. So ideally what will happen is we'll want to notify the web form that our control that it was our control that was clicked, so that the programmer can write code in that event. So for example, say we want to create a button, and our server control would implement iPostback event handler. Then we would override a method called raisEPostbackEvent, and we could send the public method that the programmer who uses our server control can use to be notified when the event occurs. We'd then use that new method and raise the event to the web form that contains the server control. And we're going to talk about this a lot more in the 5th video, understanding server control events. But for right now, just understand that if you want your web server control to trigger the postback, then you're going to need to implement the iPostback event handler and override the raisEPostbackEvent method. The other question that we asked initially at the beginning of this video was, how can we process the data in our server control when the form it resides on has been posted back to the server? How can we be notified that our server control's content has changed? And as you probably noticed as we went through the control execution lifecycle, there were a lot of phases that dealt with postback data. If we want our server control to either respond to changes in the control's value, or if we want to take on full control of how the data has been posted back and how it's processed, then we're going to need to implement another interface called iPostbackDataHandler. This interface has several methods that we can override to have a greater deal of control of how the postback data is retrieved and if our control's value has indeed been modified. For example, take a look at 2 of the methods of the iPostbackDataHandler interface. There is the load post data and the raise post data changed event. we will override the load post data to process the post back data for an ASP.NET server control, and we will be responsible for making the determination if a change has occurred in our control. And if it has, we're going to return either true or false, meaning true meaning that, yeah, a change has happened. And by telling the ASP.NET runtime this, then it's going to raise a second method that we can override called raise postback data changed event, and this is going to signal that the server control object needs to tell the ASP.NET application that the state of the control has changed so that it can capture like the text changed event, and the programmer can then respond to that any way that he wishes to. And we're going to talk about this more in the 7th video called maintaining state in a server control. So to recap this part of the video, in order to gain the functionality of posting back and of handling various things that occur to our server control while it's on the client, we're going to need to implement two different interfaces, the iPostBack event handler